Oh, I know. That's why you can't. I don't desire to.
Didn't want to do that. All right, we ready to go?
Yes, sir.
Proverbs chapter 14. Chapter 14. So let me just mention up front, this is a long chapter. Yeah, I did it. This is a long chapter, so I may or may not get through it. So that'll be fine. We'll just pick it up next time wherever we end up. But Proverbs 14. So let's dive right in. Verse 1. Verse 1, mine says, the wise woman builds her house, but the foolish pulls it down with her hands. We start off here with the woman and, her role in the household, certainly in the timing of the scripture. She was the primary one responsible for the household while the husband was out doing other things. So that's the focus here. But the main message of the proverb is the wise builds and the foolish pulls down, right? Regardless of what their particular job is, the wise builds and the foolish pulls down. What's interesting here is, it says the wise woman builds her house. And if you remember Psalm 127, you'll know it when I say it, right? It says, unless the Lord builds the house, they labor in vain who build it. So the main point here is that it's the wise woman who builds, right? It's the one who depends upon the Lord. It's the one who has wisdom that depends upon the Lord that builds. And the foolish is the one that pulls down. The one that does not depend upon the Lord, does not look at those principles, does not understand what the right ways are, that house is going to come down. Verse 2, he who walks in his uprightness fears the Lord, but he who is perverse in his ways despises him. So an interesting question here is, do you want to know if you fear the Lord? Do you want to figure out for yourself whether you fear the Lord or not? Well, the answer is right here, right? He who walks in uprightness fears the Lord. He who walks in upright. Do you walk in uprightness? Do you follow the principles? Do you follow the practices, right? That's what he's saying. That is a proof that you fear the Lord, because the other way you could read this verse is, he who fears the Lord walks in uprightness. But he who is perverse in his ways despises him, right? He who does not fear the Lord, but despises him, it says he's perverse in his ways, which really means he's all over the place. He's not focused. He goes left, then he goes right. He doesn't have a path. He doesn't have a principle to follow, and so he's perverse. He's all over the place because he does not fear the Lord. Verse 3, in the mouth of a fool is a rod of pride, but the lips of the wise will preserve him. The mouth of the fool is full of pride. It's all about me. It's all about what I do, and that's going to cause him suffering. Whereas the wise mouth, the wise who understands his position, who understands his relationship to God, that's going to preserve him. That's going to keep him from suffering, as opposed to the fool. Verse 4, where no oxen are, the trough is clean, but much increase comes from the strength of an ox. Now, I think this one is often, in the commentaries, there's two different ways of interpreting this. And I just disagree with one of them. And it says where there's no oxen are, the trough is clean. And I think you might think, well, that's, in other words, if you don't have an ox, he's not pooping. And so you don't got a lot of cleanup to do, right? But actually the word trough here is the feeding trough. It's not the place where you might collect other things. This is the feeding trough. So it really is, where there's no oxen, there's no feeding necessary. There's no work required, no labor, nothing that needs to be done. But then the second part says, but much increase comes from the strength of an ox. If you do have an ox, if you do have to feed that ox, if you do have to do labor, then there's much increase. So I think the real message here is if there's no labor, then there's nothing that comes out of it. There's no result. But if there is labor, if there is an ox, and if you do feed them, then there's much increase. With labor, there's a lot of increase. I think we've seen this proverb in other places. Verse 5. A faithful witness does not lie, but a false witness will utter lies. This one's interesting too. A faithful witness does not lie, but a false witness will utter lies. So this says two different things to me. It says you can tell who is faithful or who is false by seeing if they lie. It also says you can tell if someone is lying by looking at their character. If you flip it back and forth, it says kind of two different things. You can tell who's faithful. You can tell the character of a person by seeing if they lie. And you can tell if someone's lying by looking at their character. It just reminds me of the verse that we had back in Matthew chapter 7, where it said, a good tree bears good fruit, and a bad tree bears bad fruit, right? I mean, depending on the character is what comes out of it. And I think that's what he's saying here. Depending on the character, if you are a faithful witness, then you won't lie. If you are a false witness, then you will utter lies. The character and the actions from that character go together. I think that's the message. Verse 6. Verse 6, a scoffer seeks wisdom and does not find it, but knowledge is easy to him who understands. A scoffer, one who scoffs, who seeks wisdom in all the wrong places. Skip over to verse 9 for a minute. And here a similar verse says, fools mock at sin, but among the upright there is favor. Right? The fool is mocking, or here in verse 6, he's scoffing. And what's interesting is the connection with sin, right? The scoffer, the mocker, is sinning. And that's really the point. Without humility, in other words, and not a scoffer, they're never going to receive instruction. If they're scoffing, if they're sinning, they're never going to get what they are seeking, what they're trying to get, understanding. But they're scoffing at the Lord. They're scoffing at the fear of the Lord. Go to 1 Peter chapter 5. I'm looking at my notes and I realized I spelled something wrong. I said, what in the world does that mean? 1 Peter chapter 5. First Peter 5, verse 5, right? 1 Peter 5 says, likewise, you younger people, submit yourself to your elders. Yes, all of you be submissive to one another and be clothed with humility, for God resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble, right? Which actually takes us back to chapter 3 of Proverbs, right? Where it's essentially saying the same thing. Right? God resists the proud, God resists the scoffer, but requires humility. The other part of this, which is the other half of this verse, right, says, and knowledge is easy to him who understands. Flip back for a minute to chapter 8 of Proverbs. Chapter 8 of Proverbs, verse 9. Let's start at verse 8. Proverbs 8:8 says, all the words of my mouth are with righteousness, nothing crooked nor perverse is in them. They are all plain to him who understands, and right to those who find knowledge. Again, I think that's the message that he has here now in chapter 14. Knowledge is easy to him who understands. In other words, if you do fear the Lord, if you do search and strive for his principles, they come easy, right? Whereas the scoffer, the one who puts God down, who mocks him, who sins, he's never going to find it. But for the one who fears the Lord, who depends upon him for wisdom, on him for knowledge, it comes easy. It's easy to find God if you know God. Verse 7. Go from the presence of a foolish man when you do not perceive in him the lips of knowledge. Right? So when you are with a foolish man, he says, go from that presence. And unfortunately, in the English, this is not emphatic enough. The word go there, it really means get out of there, right? It's a very strong statement for him to get out of the presence of a foolish man. And then it kind of describes the foolish man in verse 8, right? He says, the wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit. The foolish man is all about deceit. And that's his knowledge. His knowledge is actually deceit. The folly of the fools is deceit. And he says, get away from that person. Don't stay in his presence. Don't listen to him. When you understand that that's a foolish man, that he's about deceit, go, escape. Fools scheme to deceive others. And as a result, they end up deceiving themselves about where it will lead them, right? In verse 8, the wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, but the folly of fools is deceit. His deceit, he's trying to lead others astray, actually leads him astray, and he doesn't understand his way. He doesn't understand the principles because he's all about deceit and about deceiving others. I'll just turn to this in 1 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 19. It says this, for the wisdom of the world is foolishness with God, for it is written, he catches the wise in their own craftiness, right? So that same idea, we talked about it as the boomerang, right? But he catches the wise, he's really talking about the wise in their own sense, right? Because he's talking about the wisdom of the world. He catches those with wisdom of the world in their own craftiness. I think that's again what he's saying. The fool, back in 14:8, the folly of the fools is deceit. They fall into their own mess. Verse 19 again, verse 9 again, fools mock at sin. They make excuses for sin. They joke about their sin. What's interesting in some of the translations, it actually flips this verse and it says sin mocks fools, right? Fools mock sin, but sin mocks fools. The sin mocks them. The fool, he's because of his sin, there's sin makes promises that it doesn't fulfill, right? So they're broken promises. They become slaves to sin. There are consequences of sin. So the sin itself is actually mocking the fool for following after the sin. The upright steer clear of sin, right? They're not mocking, and sin's not mocking them because they are staying clear. But among the upright there is favor, right? Among those who do not sin, they're God's favorites, as we talked about before. All right, verse 10. The heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. This is an interesting, one thing I find as I go through these, there's a lot of them I say, okay, we did that one before in a different sense, but there's a little twist to it here, and let's add that in. And then there's ones like this one, verse 10, which doesn't correlate to anything else. The heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. The heart knows its own bitterness. It knows the bitterness of itself. And a stranger does not understand the joy in a heart. They can't share in the deep joy. And so the first thing it's saying here is that no one knows the depth of your heart. No one knows your bitterness. No one knows your joy apart from God. No one else knows that. The other way you got to look at this, though, it also means that you do not know the depths of others' hearts, right? You don't know what's going on in their heart. You don't know their bitterness. You don't know their joy. And so I think there's a deeper message here that is, you don't know why other people act the way they do because you don't know what's going on behind the scenes, right? You don't know why they're annoying or they're short, or why they're sullen, or why they responded to you with a sharp tongue, or why they just ignored you, because you don't know the bitterness or the joy that's in their heart. And this is why in the New Testament, why turning the other cheek is so important, right? If we really care about other people and they abuse us in some way with their word or with their action, this is why turning the other, because we don't know why they've done that. Maybe it's not because they're just a mean person. Maybe it's because they really got something going on, right? You don't know their heart. You don't know their bitterness. The other thing I'd say along this lines is we share prayer requests in here at the end. And, someone will share a prayer request and then we don't hear about that thing again for a while, or maybe it never comes up again. But that for that person, that prayer request is probably still very much active, right? That situation is still something they're dealing with over and over and over. And so it just encourages, it should encourage us to remember these prayer requests, right? And to check up on somebody. Hey, you mentioned a couple of weeks ago, your cousin or your friend or your sister or yourself in this particular situation. How's it going, right? Because we don't we don't know the depth of their heart. We don't know what they're dealing with day in and day out. So checking up on one another is really important. Because somebody's not going to bring the same thing up over and over and over they don't want to be, quote, annoying, but it's still something they're dealing with. So anyway, that's the heart knows its own bitterness, and a stranger does not share its joy. Verse 11. The house of the wicked will be overthrown, but the tent of the upright will flourish. The thing you got to focus on here is the interesting difference in it's the house of the wicked and the tent of the upright, right? Even though you would think a house would be more stable, would be a better place to live, right? It's the house that gets overthrown and the tent that flourishes, right? Because it doesn't depend upon the house. It doesn't depend upon the lodging. It doesn't depend upon the stuff of this world. It depends upon wickedness, and it depends upon uprightness. The wicked will be overthrown. The upright will flourish, regardless of the abode, regardless of how they look on the outside. There's a whole series of proverbs right here in the middle that focus on things are not how they seem. They look one way, but in reality, there's something else going on. And this is the first one. The house looks pretty stable, but it's going to be overthrown because of wickedness. The tent, I'm not so sure about it, but because of uprightness, it's going to flourish. Verse 12. There's a way that seems right to a man, but the end of its way is death, right? Very similar to what I just said. It appears that this man thinks he's doing everything okay. There's a way that seems right to him in his judgment, in his mind, in his wisdom, but the end of that way is death. Don't count on your own smart self, is what this says, right? I want you to turn for a minute to Romans chapter 1. To take the maybe an extreme example of this, but Romans chapter 1. Romans chapter 1, verse 27, 28. Says, likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burning in their lust for another man, with men committing what is shameful and receiving in themselves the penalty of their error which was due. And even as they did not like to retain God in their knowledge, God gave them over to a debased mind to do the things which are not fitting. Right? God gave them over to a debased mind. They thought, right, there was a way that seemed right to a man. He thought he was doing what the world says was just fine. But the end of that way is death. God gave them over to a debased mind. They did not like to retain God in their knowledge. They didn't want to listen to his principles. and God gave them over. God gave them over. All right, back in Proverbs, verse 13. Even in laughter, the heart may sorrow, and the end of mirth may be grief. Right? Even in laughter, the heart may sorrow. This is connected to the verse that was before, right? The end of mirth comes from following the way that seems right, the way that seems right to a man. There's laughter in that, but the end of that is grief. The end of mirth, the second half, the end of mirth may be grief. The end of laughter, the end of following after the way that seems right to a man is grief and is death, as verse 12 says. The other thing I think, though, that's in here is that laughter sometimes is used to hide real pain, real heartbreak. Some people use drugs and alcohol to deal with tough stuff. Other people use laughter and joking. So we need to be paying attention. Again, we need to be compassionate. Verse 14. The backslider in heart will be filled with his own ways, but a good man will be satisfied from above. The backslider in heart will be filled with his own ways. So the backslider in heart will be filled with his own ways. Go back to chapter 1 a minute, Proverbs. Verse 31. Similar one, it says, well, you can start at verse 30. It says, they would have none of my counsel and despise my every rebuke, and therefore they shall eat the fruit of their own way and be filled with the full of their own fancies. Right? That's what he's saying here again. The backslider in heart will be filled with their own ways. He will get the results of not following the principles. He will get the results of not doing what he should do. Now, let me ask you this question. Why did the backslider backslide? The backslider in heart, the backslider who was following these principles, stopped following these principles. Why did he do that?
Usually not intentional.
He thought his ways were better.
You thought what?
His ways were better.
You thought his ways were better, Joe said? Why does a backslider backslide?
Was it based on what's in the heart?
I didn't hear you, Debbie.
I'm sorry, I'm just focused on when it's saying in the heart. So was his heart not really right with the Lord in the first place? I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
That's good. That's good.
Could it have something to do with when Jesus told the story about the man who built his house on the sand versus the man who built his house on the rock?
Yep. It could have something to do with that, Bill. Why does a backslider backslide?
Because he stopped seeking
Yeah.
wisdom, stopped seeking the Lord.
Stop focusing on God.
Good.
So
Good.
selfishness.
Good. One thing so let me just throw out a really important principle, and that is, well, I'm trying to not answer the question, but what does it take to keep these principles? So the backslider, he stopped keeping the principles. What does it take to keep the principles?
You seek the Lord every day, all the time. It's a never-ending quest to know the Lord and study His Word. And
Good.
if you're doing that and you seek yourself, like Rick was saying, then you end up, not being blessed by the Lord. He departs.
Good. That's good. Anything else?
You know that when Peter stepped out of the boat, as long as he had his eye on Christ, he walked on the water. But as soon as he turned his eye to the storm instead of Christ, he began to sink.
That's good.
Yeah. These are all really good. Y'all are good today. Let me add one
Just
thing
to-
just to let me add one thing just to cap it. The Christian life, or following the principles, is impossible without Christ. Right? So the backslider who stops following the principles because he's trying to do it in his own effort. Right? He reads Proverbs and he goes, okay, I need to do this, and I need to do that, I need to do this, and I need to do that. And he doesn't realize wisdom is Christ, right? And to do these principles, you got to have Christ and you got to depend on him. Without Christ, you can't do this stuff. It takes us all the way back to the Beatitudes, right? The Beatitudes are not a list of things you need to do. They're characteristics of Christ. It's not do these things and you will be blessed. And it's the same thing here. The backslider is someone who's not relying upon Christ and trying to do these principles in his own strength. And that backslider is going to be filled with his own ways. He's going to get what he deserves by not following Christ. But I love the second part too. A good man will be satisfied from above. Right? He's not satisfied by his own ways. He's not satisfied by this world. He's not satisfied by some action that happens because of something that he does. He's satisfied from above. He's satisfied from God. God satisfies him. Christ satisfies. That's his satisfaction, both in this world and in the next. That's his satisfaction. That's his joy. That's his blessing from above. From above.
Hey,
You're
Rich,
gonna have to ponder that one on yourself. That's a big one. Go ahead. Yes.
where they differentiate between house and tent, he differentiates in my versions between conduct and deeds. The disloyal will get what his conduct deserves, where the good one what his deeds deserve. Anything on that?
I'm missing your point. Can you try again?
Well, on that he says it's disloyal will get what his conduct deserves. So his conduct, whereas the good one, what his deeds. I would assume there's something different between conduct and deeds.
And you're reading this in verse 14?
Yeah, the whole thing says the disloyal one will get what his conduct deserves, and the good one what his deeds deserve.
I have no idea. That's so different from what I have. It's hard for me to understand that. And I'd have to go back and look at the original Greek and see what the difference is in the words there.
Yeah, and the footnotes don't really answer it either.
Yeah. Okay. Homework. All right, verse 15 then. Verse 15, the simple believes every word, but the prudent considers well his steps. We dealt with this one a little bit before. In fact, if you go back to verse 8 that we looked at a little bit earlier, right? The wisdom of the prudent is to understand his way, right? To understand his way. And here it says the prudent considers well his steps. Whereas the simple, and remember mine uses the word simple, and some of the commentaries or some of the translations use the word the uncommitted. Here it's always, this word always means those who do not follow the principles, i.e. those who are unsaved, right? So they believe every word. They listen to all the stuff that is said on the news and what everybody thinks in the world is popular, right? They trust in the stupidest things, like the majority, right? The majority says this, so therefore, whatever. If everybody says that, then therefore that must be right? Whereas the prudent considers well his steps. He takes actions that are informed by wisdom. He takes actions that are informed by the principles. That's the prudent. Remember that word, actions informed by wisdom. That's what he does. He understands his way. And he, a member of the Smithfield Bible study group posted something on Facebook one day about about discernment, and some dingling on there yelled at them, judge not, right? We really do. The Bible teaches us to be prudent and to consider our steps, right? To discern what's true and what's not true. 1 John 4 says, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits. In Philippians, it talks about discerning what is best. In Romans, it talks about testing that you may discern the will of God. There is hundreds of passages that tell us to discern. There's one passage that says, judge not. And you remember when we studied that, the judgment had to do with condemnation, right? Do not condemn another. Do not judge them in such a sense that you've thrown them out of your life, or thrown them out in the way you think about them. But God wants us to discern. God wants us to be prudent and understand our way and our actions. That's just a little, that was free, just added on for free. All right, verse 16. A wise man fears and departs from evil, but a fool rages and is self-confident. A wise man fears, and obviously he's talking about he fears the Lord, right? A wise man fears the Lord and departs from evil because he understands what God says about evil. The fool is, he rages, or he rushes, he's careless, he's headlong, he's self-confident. I know what's best, and he gets himself in trouble. The wise man fears and departs from evil. Right? Connect to verse 17. A quick-tempered man acts foolishly. A man of wicked intentions is hated. Right? The quick-tempered man, the one who just jumps right in and dives headlong, his evil devices and schemes are hated both by man and by God. We're going to deal more with this when I get to verse 29. So I'm not going to say any more about this idea, but this idea is really important. Verse 18. The simple inherit folly, but the prudent are crowned with knowledge. Right? The uncommitted, the unsaved, all they can inherit is folly. All they can inherit is the wrath of God. But the prudent are crowned with knowledge. The word crowned here can also be they're surrounded by knowledge. They have knowledge all around them. The prudent, the one who acts on wisdom, has knowledge all around them. It's very easy for them. Go back to chapter 3. Thank you. Chapter 3, verse 35. A similar verse says, the wise shall inherit glory, or be crowned with glory, but shame shall be the legacy of fools. Right? It's a very similar statement to what we have here. The simple inherit folly, the prudent are crowned with knowledge. Verse 19, the evil will bow before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. The evil will bow before the good, and the wicked at the gates of the righteous. So that seems like an odd verse. But there are a couple things that you do believe, right? You do believe from Philippians 2:10 that at the name of Jesus, every knee shall bow. That you believe, right? And you also believe from 2 Timothy 2:12, we will also reign with him, right? If we reign with Christ, and at the name of Christ, every knee shall bow, then verse 19 is not a problem. The evil will bow before the good, the wicked at the gates of the righteous. This is obviously at the end times, right? The evil will bow before the good, the wicked at the gates of the righteous. It at the very least, it means that. To try to apply that to a practical daily thing, maybe you don't see that, but it certainly will be true at the end time. Verse 20. Verse 20 is an interesting verse. It says, the poor man is hated even by his own neighbor, but the rich has many friends. I think this is just true. Right? We love rich people. We want to be like them. We want them to be our friends. Those poor people, they're annoying. We hate them. We wish they weren't around. Look at verse 21. He who despises his neighbor sins, but he who has mercy on the poor, happy is he. So first in verse 20, he's kind of stating a reality, right? That we, in ourselves, in our own selves, we'd rather be with rich people than with poor people. But verse 21, he who despises his neighbor, in other words, he's really talking about his poor neighbor, he sins. And he who has mercy on the poor is happy. This takes us right back to, well, let's just turn to Matthew chapter 22. Matthew 22. Verse 37. Right, when Jesus gives his summary. Start of verse 36, Matthew 22, right? Teacher, which is the great commandment in the law? Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. This is the first and great commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments hang the law and the prophets. He's saying nothing different here. He despises his neighbor sins. You ought to be loving him. Love your neighbor. Love those who are downtrodden. We have more to talk about this in a minute. The real issue here is that the neighbor, this poor person, has value in God's eyes. So don't you dare discount them. Look at verse 31 for a minute. I'm going to get to this a little bit later, but I want you to get the point now. Verse 31, he who oppresses the poor reproaches his maker, right? He who oppresses the poor slaps God in the face. He who does not lift up the poor is reproaching God. God made this person. He's of value to God. How dare you think lowly of him? He's a God-created being. Verse 22. We'll say more about that when we get down there. Maybe today. Verse 22. Do they not go astray who devise evil, but mercy and truth belong to those who devise good? And I think this is connected back with 21 about the neighbor. He's saying those who devise evil against his neighbor, they go astray. They are not following God's path. But mercy and truth belong to those who devise good for them, right? Those who one of the, mine says mercy and truth. One of the translations said loving devotion and a firm foundation belong to those who devise good. I like that. But those who devise evil, there again, it's this idea of wandering. They go astray. They've left the path. One of the commentaries said they're wandering drunkards, right? They're devising evil and they're just wandering all over the place. And this is the picture that Proverbs has again and again about those who don't know God, don't follow God, don't know the principles, don't know the path. And so they end up just wandering all over the place, devising evil, going astray. Verse 23, in all labor there is profit, but idle chatter leads only to poverty. The planners, in all labor there is profit, but idle chatter leads to poverty. What am I looking at here? Oh yeah, I mean, if all you do is talk, you're going to get poverty, right? If you don't actually do anything, if you don't actually labor, that's where the profit is. That's, honest labor is a good thing, but idle chatter leads only to poverty. And by the way, this is not just physical, it's also spiritual, right? If all you do is talk, about what God wants and talk about who God is, but don't actually do anything about it, there's no profit. There's only poverty of spirit if all you're doing is talking about it. Verse 24, the crown of the wise is their riches, but the foolishness of fools is folly. The crown of the wise is their riches. The crown, which is a visible sign of God's favor, he's saying that visible sign is their riches. Now, I'm going to contradict myself here in a minute, but let me say this. You need to be okay with that, right? That sometimes God favor is shown by riches, by giving us money, by giving us things, right? Sometimes God's favor is shown that way, and you should be okay with that. Now, this is one of those things where the health and wealth people have stolen the idea, and we therefore look down on it, that there's some connection between prosperity and following after God. Proverbs very clearly says there's a connection between following after God and prosperity. Now, it's got to be balanced though, right? So if you look back at verse 18 that we said, right? It says the prudent are crowned with knowledge. Here it says the crown is knowledge that we get. And then in the verse that we're looking at, verse 24, the crown is riches. So I think we can't ignore the physical reality of God's favor, but he's more concerned about the spiritual reality of his favor, right? The knowledge and the wisdom and staying on the path. The foolishness of fools is folly. The foolishness of fools is folly. The foolish efforts of fools only end in folly. That is their inheritance, as we'll see a little bit further down. Verse 25. A true witness delivers souls, but a deceitful witness speaks lies. A true witness delivers souls. A true witness delivers souls. Now, I want you to turn. I'm going to give you a verse and I'm going to want you to turn to it. But I want to warn you ahead of time. Once you read this verse, you're going to be responsible for this verse. So this might be where some of you just want to put your fingers in your ears and go, nah, 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 so you don't hear this. So you're not responsible for it, okay? But if you'll go with me, I want you to go to Ezekiel chapter 3. Now, of course, I got to find Ezekiel.
Yeah.
Go to Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel. Ezekiel chapter 3. Ezekiel chapter 3, verse 18. It's one of the verses you probably ought to put a little asterisk next to. Ezekiel 3, 18. It says, when I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way to save his life, that same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. When I say to the wicked, you shall surely die, and you give him no warning, nor speak to warn the wicked from his wicked way, to save his life, that same wicked man shall die in his iniquity, but his blood I will require at your hand. I don't know exactly what this verse means, but it at least means that there is a level of responsibility that we have for telling others that they are wicked and that they need to be saved. Because if we don't, and we have the opportunity to warn someone, and we do not warn them, then his blood I will require at your hand. I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good. This verse was a motivation for me to speak to my brother about salvation. I didn't want him going to eternity and dying in his iniquity and his blood being required at my hand. I think God puts people in our path that he has an expectation that we need to speak to them. We need to warn them. We need to save them. And if we don't, their blood will be required at our hands. I don't know what that means, but it doesn't sound good. I have one brother that I was able to speak to, and he was saved. I have another brother that died young before I had that opportunity. So now you know that verse. Go back to Proverbs. I think we're in verse 25. A true witness delivers souls. Are you a true witness? Are you delivering souls? A deceitful witness speaks lies. Deceitful witness speaks lies and doesn't deliver souls. Verse 26. In the fear of the Lord there is strong confidence, and his children will have a place of refuge. The fear of the Lord is a fountain of life, to turn one away from the snares of death. So in both of these verses, it starts off with the fear of the Lord. And you know, we've talked about, and we will continue to talk about the fear of the Lord over and over again in Proverbs. So this gives us more insight here. The fear of the Lord, there is strong confidence, and the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. The fear of the Lord gives us a great stability and a great sense of security, that confidence in him. And it is life. It is the fountain of life. The other thing I wanted to focus on in this verse is the second part of verse 26. And his children will have a place of refuge. The word here again really means his offspring, his children's children. If you remember last week in chapter 13, go back to verse 22, 13:22, it says, a good man leaves an inheritance to his children's children, but the wealth of the sinner is stored up in righteousness. And we made the point that he's not so much talking about money there as he's talking about these principles. He's talking about salvation, right? And I think what he's saying here is, in the fear of the Lord, there is a strong confidence in your own security. But he also says that because of the fear of the Lord that you have, your children will have a place of refuge. Now, that doesn't mean that your children are saved through you, but your children are certainly influenced by your fear of the Lord, right? By your fear of the Lord, the children see, hey, that's a place of refuge. That's something I can depend on. That's something that was important to mom, to grandpa, etc. Because the fear of the Lord is a fountain of life. It is life. It is how this life gets lived. It is eternal life. And it turns one away from the snares of death. The snares, the things that capture people, the things that keep them from having an abundant life. So that's a powerful 2 verses. Verse 28. Verse 28, and it's 9:54. So I think I'm going to stop there because there's the really important one I want you to get in 29 and 30. So I'm going to stop here, and we'll pick this up next time to finish up 14 and then dive into 15. As I've said before, this whole section until we get to chapter 22 is kind of one big section, and so that we stop at a particular place is not all that important. So we will stop here at verse 28. All right, let me just see. Let me parse my learnings that I wrote down at the end. So let me just give you those up to this point. First of all, God's principles and his paths and his steps are not hidden, but they're plain and they're clear to those that know him. His principles, his paths, his steps are not hidden, but they're plain and clear to those who know him. Secondly, you don't know what's going on in people's lives. So therefore, treat everyone with compassion. Think about turning the other cheek a little bit. Think about taking some abuse in order to save someone else's life. Thirdly, the appearances in this world are deceiving, and true reality will be revealed in the consequences. Right? Appearances in this world are deceiving, but true reality is going to be revealed in the consequences. Fourthly, following the principles is impossible without Christ. Right? Nextly, discernment is critical in the Christian life, whereas judgment a la condemnation is an abomination to God. You're supposed to discern, but you're not to throw people under the bus. And then I'll just say Ezekiel 3:19. Okay. I'll save the other ones for next time. Anything else that you picked up today? I got all the good ones?
Yeah.
All right. Looks like Hugh is not here, so I will take the prayer requests. We stop the recording. By the way, I got all of the recordings up yesterday, so we're up to date on the recordings. For those of you who